Corporate culture treats sensitivity as a professional flaw. Managers tell employees to toughen up and view emotional reactivity as a serious liability in demanding environments. Science points in the opposite direction. This is the biological reality of the highly sensitive person, which is a neurological profile shared by 20% of the population. We are going to examine decades of psychological research, starting from a fundamental 1996 discovery and moving to the genetic difference between orchids and dandelions. The data shows that processing stimuli deeply does not make someone weak. It creates the neurological framework required for effective leadership. The clinical definition of this trait started taking shape in 1996. Clinical psychologist Dr. Elaine Aron noticed a pattern in her practice, leading her to identify a biological difference she called sensory processing sensitivity. This affects roughly 1 in 5 people globally. It is not a personality type, and it does not qualify as a disorder. The central nervous system of a highly sensitive person simply absorbs physical and social stimuli at a higher volume. They notice small shifts in lighting, pick up on unsaid tension during a meeting, and register micro-expressions that bypass everyone else entirely. This high-definition processing comes with a heavy biological cost. Taking in that much data exhausts the brain rapidly, which caused society to misinterpret the trait for decades by labeling these individuals as fragile rather than observant. Dr. Aron established a 4-part framework called D.O.E.S to explain this neurological difference. The first pillar stands for depth of processing. An average worker looks at a quarterly report and sees numbers, but a highly sensitive person immediately spots the underlying behavioral trends driving those numbers. They anticipate bottlenecks weeks before they threaten the supply chain. That constant analysis leads directly to the second pillar, which is overstimulation. Processing large amounts of data requires high energy reserves. When placed in an open-plan office with ringing phones and frequent interruptions, their nervous system overloads. The resulting burnout convinced mid-century corporate culture that sensitive people lacked the stamina for management. They assumed a quiet employee retreating to a dark room was breaking under pressure. The reality involved a biological need to clear the mental cache. That need for quiet recovery blinded managers to the final 2 pillars of the framework. The third component involves strong emotional reactivity and empathy. Highly sensitive people mirror the feelings of those around them almost involuntarily. If a team member feels undervalued, the sensitive leader feels that frustration physically, meaning they address morale issues long before employees start quitting. The fourth pillar is sensing small details. They detect inconsistencies in a competitor's pitch and catch lies almost instantly. Put these 4 traits together, and you get a person who reads rooms accurately, anticipates market shifts, and understands employee motivations on a cellular level. This explains why the traditional management style is losing ground to leaders who actively listen. If you're finding value in this psychological breakdown, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We release heavily researched videos just like this every single week. Now we will look at history. For decades, the business world promoted the loudest voice in the room. Boards rewarded executives who gave aggressive speeches and ignored collateral damage. That brute force approach worked during the industrial era, when managing people meant tracking factory output. The modern knowledge economy requires a different skill set. Companies fail when communication breaks down across complex global teams. An executive who cannot read the emotional undercurrents of a video call will miss serious warnings from their engineers. The traditional manager creates large blind spots for their organization, while a highly sensitive leader naturally fills those gaps. They do more than just hear what their employees say out loud. They process the hesitation in a senior developer's voice and halt a doomed product launch before it damages the company's reputation. We can see this exact dynamic playing out at the highest levels of historical power. Abraham Lincoln governed the United States through its bloodiest conflict, yet contemporaries noted his constant melancholy and deep emotional absorption. His sensitivity allowed him to understand the motivations of his fiercest political rivals. Instead of crushing his opponents, Lincoln appointed them to his cabinet. He built his famous team of rivals because he could separate his own ego from the needs of the nation. His nervous system registered the heavy grief of the American public, and that empathy gave him the moral clarity required to push through the Emancipation Proclamation. A less sensitive president would have fractured the fragile coalition, keeping the country intact. That same ability to absorb and redirect collective emotion defined the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. experienced periods of severe emotional exhaustion from carrying the heavy systemic injustice of a nation on his shoulders. He did not build a nationwide movement through aggressive domination. He achieved it by channeling his high sensitivity into a deep understanding of the human condition. King could stand in front of a divided crowd and speak directly to their unarticulated fears. He sensed the emotional temperature of the country, which allowed him to time his campaigns for optimal political impact. His empathy was not a byproduct of his leadership, but rather functioned as the core engine driving millions of people to demand peaceful, structural change against steep odds. The demand for this type of leadership has only accelerated in the 21st century. On March 15, 2019, a tragic attack in Christchurch left 51 people dead. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern faced a defining national crisis. Instead of relying on the standard playbook of projecting cold, militaristic strength, she responded with visible and unfiltered distress. She wore a hijab to meet with the grieving community and physically embraced the families affected by the tragedy. Her deeply sensitive response did not make her look weak to the international community. It unified her country and set a new standard for crisis management. The public response proved that citizens no longer want robotic authority figures, and instead want leaders who feel the impact of their decisions. To understand why these highly sensitive figures perform so well, we have to look at pediatric research. Developmental pediatrician Dr. Thomas Boyce spent years studying human biological reactivity, eventually publishing his findings as the Orchid and Dandelion hypothesis. He discovered that the majority of humans operate like dandelions. They possess a hardy and resilient biological makeup. You can place a dandelion in a mediocre public school, a dysfunctional corporate office, or a slightly bad relationship, and they will survive just fine. They naturally block out the negative stimuli around them. The trade-off is that their performance remains relatively flat, regardless of where they are planted. A dandelion manager will deliver average results in a bad company, and they will deliver average results in a functional company. Highly sensitive people, however, function as orchids. Their nervous systems absorb every single drop of the environment they inhabit. When you place an orchid in an abusive workplace, they wither rapidly. They internalize the stress of micromanaging bosses, absorb the anxiety of their coworkers, and burn through their adrenal reserves just trying to get through the week. The result is total systemic collapse. This severe negative reaction explains why society wrongly categorized sensitivity as a weakness for so many generations. Observers only saw the orchid failing in a harsh climate. They watched a talented employee quit a high-pressure sales floor and incorrectly assumed the person simply lacked ambition or drive. They never considered changing the soil. The scientific data changes what we know about human potential. Dr. Boyce proved that when you take that exact same orchid and place them in a healthy, supportive environment, they do not just heal, they grow to be highly capable, consistently outperforming the dandelions. Because a highly sensitive person absorbs everything, placing them in a positive leadership role allows them to consume large amounts of constructive data. They take good resources and multiply them. An orchid executive will recognize a junior employee's hidden talent, restructure a failing department with care, and build a loyal leadership team. Their deep processing stops being a liability and transforms into a clear biological advantage. They see the entire board, while everyone else is just looking at the pieces. For decades, the business world demanded that orchids turn themselves into dandelions. We rewarded the loudest talkers while ignoring the deepest thinkers. That era is ending. The modern economy requires leaders who understand human motivation, detect subtle shifts in the market, and process information with clarity. Sensitivity is not a handicap you have to overcome. It is the hardware upgrade most executives wish they had. If this breakdown changed your perspective on leadership, hit the subscribe button and join us for our next video.